Well, good afternoon and welcome to A Reason for Hope. Happy Monday. And of course, today is my favorite graphic.
Apologetics Monday.
Apologetics Monday. Thanks for joining us. Pleasure to be here. Hope you had a nice weekend. And today we have a lot. A subject that, for some of us here in this part of the West, probably don't know that people take absolutely seriously. So it's actually a growing movement, and we'll get into that in a moment. But if you're new, this is A Reason for Hope, a weekday Bible answer program where we take questions from our live stream audience about the historic Christian faith, the Bible, about how to apply and live the Christian life, all the kinds of things that, the questions of life. Where do we come from? Where are we going? What does living really mean? Does God exist? And which religion of the world is the best expression of that God? So that and many other questions we've handled on this program for, how long has it been, Sean?
It's 24 years now.
24 years. So Pastor Scott and his faithful protege, an all-around good guy, have really done a phenomenal job as far as I'm concerned, Bible experts and Bible scholarly people in the sense that they spend all their time just really studying truth, learning the scriptures, and then being ready to give an answer for anyone who asks to give a reason for the hope that we have. And sometimes they do it gently too, which is good. But if you want to ask a question on the program, it's very simple. Just join us online. Use the comment section, ask your questions. We'll take it from there. This is off the cuff, except for Mondays, we focus on a topic. So if you have a question pertaining to today's topic, then feel free to ask about that. Otherwise, we'll save it for later on in the week. We do this every weekday, Monday through Friday, 4 to 5 p.m. Mountain Standard, Arizona time. So we appreciate any question you have as long as it's related to the Bible, Christian faith, how to interpret the scriptures, and so on. If you have a personal question, we'd ask that you email it to us. Otherwise, you can just ask away here online. You can go to our YouTube channel, which is A Reason for Hope, or you can go straight to our URL, which is youtube.com/@areason4hope. You could also catch us on Facebook. Our church Facebook page is Calvary Christian Fellowship of Tucson, Arizona. And you can, of course, go straight to our URL by going to facebook.com/CCF Tucson. That's /CCF Tucson. We're also live streaming to the X platform. The way you'll know when we're on live and to use that platform is by following our senior pastor. And his Twitter or X handle is ScottR4H. That's Scott, the letter R, the number 4, the letter H. And of course, I would encourage you to follow him on the X platform, as it's very informative, very entertaining feed. He's quite active. And so if you're interested in an actual pastor who's going to give a biblical take on current events, especially as it pertains to biblical prophecy. We want to stay in touch with how should Christians view what is happening in the world as it pertains to the nation of Israel. Not only will you get updates throughout the week here on this program, but you'll also get the latest news, the latest critical updates by following his X feed. Also, catch the program on our website. So if you want to avoid social media altogether or don't want to have your public profile all over some question that you think might be silly or perhaps personal, you can just go to our website, hit the Watch Live tab. Not only can you ask questions, there's a little chat box, but you also can hit the prayer button and send a prayer request to our prayer team. We'd be happy to go before the Lord on your behalf. If you want to avoid, like I said, any kind of public question asking, you have something more sensitive, you can just email us, and that email address is questions@areasonforhope.org. That's questions@hope.org. With that said, we'll take a moment to pray, and then we'll get into today's I think you'll find it very interesting topic. Pastor Sean, would you?
Be an honor. Dad, thank you for the honor you've given us to share your word. We want to ask for the kind of heart that not only went into when it was first spoken, but even more importantly, as we continue to share it, we do so with your voice as much as your truth and your heart. continue to do a work in all of our lives where we want to model you and the things that we do and the reason why we do them. We pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen. All right.
Well, what do you got for us today, Sean?
Yeah. As those of you who aren't aware, at the time of this recording, we are currently in the middle of a Pastors and Leaders Conference, which is being hosted by Robert Furrow at Calvary Tucson. We were spending the majority of the day there, so I wasn't able to go into a more in-depth topic apart from the ones that I had already studied in depth. So this is largely based off of my own notes, and if you want more information on this, I have a lot of resources available on this particular religious group on my YouTube page. So feel free to ask about that. We'll send you some links. But the topic is what we would call a Asatru, or the way of the Azir. It goes by many names: Odinism, Norse Paganism, but it would essentially be the Norse mythology. Obviously, we see their namesakes being popularized through Marvel comics and so forth, with Thor and Odin and Loki and so forth. But this is not the modern fantastizations of it, but actually the original sources and people who are treating this as a legitimate worldview. For those of you who aren't aware, in the last 50 years, the country of Iceland made this an official state religion and was recognized by the United States as well as many others. And people like Stephen McNellan, the Asatru Alliance, and many, many others, both in the U.S. and outside, have taken essentially up the acts of the old ways, as it's known. And it is, as is the case with the internet, becoming a lot more popular than you think it would. And we'll be happy to address other worldviews as they come along. Black Hebrew Israelites will be on the list. You can be certain. Excuse me. You can be certain. Now, as we oftentimes say on the program, the blessing of the internet has also come with its own series of curses. Well, it is a fantastic resource for getting the gospel out and communicating effectively at a range that would be unheard of at any other time in history. It would also give equal opportunity and means for every other claim and idea to be shared just as quickly and effectively. So with the revival of modern pagan movements, it's not surprising that people who can just throw out ideas, whether it's pagan myth origins. Jesus was actually based on Balder, don't you know? And, of course, not counting on people being able to look up things like the Prosetus, Baldur's Drummer, and others and say, that doesn't make any lick of sense in the comparison.
I thought that was a video game, Baldur's Gate or something.
No, that's a newer one. But the term Baldur is actually, according to a lot of scholars in this area, a very recent invention in Norse paganism that was a copy of Jesus, but the actual version didn't have a lot in common with him at all. The point being made, though, is this: when people are able to claim false things, or even things contrary to true things like Christianity, just as effectively and just as quickly, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, because it presents for us an opportunity to engage with people on those views and to hold them accountable to the claims they've made, since it's all on tape or video, if you will. Now, this is why, and the reason why I'm bringing this up as a topic for Apologetics Monday, is that we all need to be in a place where we're not only ready to give an answer to anyone who asks a reason for the hope that is within us, but also why we need to be prepared to engage seriously with ideas that aren't our own. So, if you can master the art of knowing your beliefs and having enough confidence to hold the standards you have for truth and the reasons you have to trust it against anyone else's claims, then you're going to be a very effective communicator and form the type of relationships God can use very powerfully. So, for example, I made a video a while back and just explaining why I don't believe certain things: Islam, Zoroastrianism, just whatever was requested of me. People would leave a name of a religion. I'd look it up. I'd study it. I'd make a video saying, here's my problems. Well, one of those things was Norse paganism, because, as those of you who can't see my skin color, I am very much in heavy Swedish and Dutch descent. I am, say, chalk Asian, as my username would oftentimes note. But the point I'm making in discussing these worldviews isn't to insult a religious worldview. But when it put me on the radar, of the Norse pagan community, I realized there's a lot more names behind
You
this.
even had a debate, kind of a written debate, right? Where
3 recorded debates and a third that was attempted, but ultimately the person backed out. The point, though, is I've had very good and some bad conversations with Norse pagans who take their views in a variety of different ways. And just from my experience, I want to share with you the kind of things I've learned along the way in understanding that this is a methodology I hope becomes very common in the body of Christ. Being willing to say, okay, someone made this claim about religion, maybe mine, maybe theirs, on the internet. I'm going to look that up. And instead of saying you're a liar, you're false, you're an apostate, you're antichrist, you're demon-possessed, I'm going to say, that's interesting because I read this. Could you clarify? And that's going to accomplish a lot more than someone who's just going to come out full guns blazing and burn the heathen. So understand, we want to be effective communicators. We want to form the kind of relationships God can use. And so with our experience on the internet, we want to turn these curses into a blessing. And one of my more prominent ones was my interaction with the Asatru or Norse pagan community. In that, essentially, I had 3 approaches, 3 basic outline to the kind of things that I want to make sure all of you are taking, not just regarding your own beliefs, but compared to other religions in what would constitute little more than a month of research. It's not difficult at all. The first thing that I did was I took a historical approach. I asked questions about what are the historical strengths of Christianity and then applying those same strengths, looking for those same strengths in another religion. Because understand, while that may be uncomfortable for some people, they may say, ooh, but what if I examine the historical origins of these religions and I find out that they're just as true as Christianity? Well, that wouldn't be the case. Christianity claims things that would contradict those religions, so either one of them would have to be true or both could be false. But if someone has something going for it, we don't do ourselves any favors by hiding that information from others or ourselves. If they have a strength, by all means put it forward. It doesn't mean that it's 100% conclusive, but that's, again, a rule we can play by. We don't say Jesus was a historical figure, therefore all of Christianity is true. You can do the same rules for anything regarding other world religions. You could say, oh, well, the Norse pagans certainly had a long-standing tradition of the worship of their gods. That doesn't mean that their gods were real. It means that there's a very interesting chain of information there. So when we're comparing what each other's strengths and weaknesses are, we can acknowledge strengths and we can draw attention to weaknesses and say that I have more going for me than less. I think that that's fair. The second is the doctrinal approach. What would be the claims of those religious views against Christianity or for their own view? And how would we challenge them on a fair basis, not being like, you're wrong, you're apostate, you're liars. No, just being able to say, within your own worldview, make this make sense for me, because I'm seeing a problem not just in my worldview, but I've read your sources and see a problem within your own worldview, that there is some internal inconsistency here. And even that is going to create a moniker of respect from people, most people at least, because if you take the time to read their holy book, it's going to give you an in. And I don't mean that in terms of manipulation. I'm saying that if someone were to come to me and say that, you Christians, you're a cult and you just copied a bunch of pagan myths and so forth, obviously the first thing I'm going to say is, where and when? Have you read the Bible? And they'd say, no, but I saw a YouTube video on it once, and that shows that you're all a bunch of, fill in the blank. And I'm not going to give that person the time of day, let alone any respect or regard for what he has to say. But if, on the other hand, they have read something that I haven't, and they would bring this information up, I would respect the fact that they at least took the time to do their homework, that they took my religion seriously enough and cared about me enough to meet me on my terms. And since the prose and poetic edists collectively are much shorter than the New Testament, that's not asking a lot in this context. But if a Muslim comes along Take the time to read the Quran, Hadith, or not all the Hadith, obviously, but relevant Hadith. And, of course, be able to look up individual claims as they come along. If a Hindu comes along, say, well, can I look at the Bhagavad Gita and get back to you on that? Or do you have a good translation of the Ramayana that you'd respect? So on and so forth. This isn't difficult in the day of information. But if we care enough about people to meet them on their terms, the first and most important thing we need to be able to ask is, if I was on this receiving end conversation, would I respect what I was hearing, or would I feel disrespected, and not for the quote-unquote greater good either? And then finally, I took a more personal approach in regarding my testimony. There are ways to communicate things to people that will be relevant to them. There'll be ways to communicate facts to people that they just won't care about. How do we make what we're talking about relevant, and the sort of things that we should get to know about people regarding not just their worldview, but them personally? Because even within the Norse pagan community, there are people who would claim to be followers of Odin and yet don't take it seriously at all. It's little more than a hobby to them, and they're more in terms of an agnostic. Now, I would talk to a polytheist, animist pagan a lot differently than I would talk to an agnostic, but if I treat them as both the same, stuff's going to go over their heads. So when it comes to these things, it's all about effective ministry. Just, again, sharing my experience and the sort of things to keep in mind that can apply in a large swath of different worldviews.
Because you've engaged with a lot of people who hold to these views, but it's almost in a mockery sense. Basically, they're just trolling the world, or specifically Christians, Muslims, and Jews, which are the predominant, monotheistic religions of the world. It seems like some folks are just there to kind of bother people and show, I'm a Norse pagan, or whatever they would call themselves, and it's just a mockery. But you have come across people who sincerely and genuinely believe this older Western pagan, and which I guess you'd call it polytheistic religion.
Yeah, and again, in my experience, I'll just skip to that part in my notes here. In my experience, I've had 5 different types of Norse pagans. The more prominent and intellectual ones are not pagans themselves. They're agnostics with a hobby, that they would be more affiliated with Norse mythology in terms of not necessarily believing in them, but finding their stories something they personally resonate with, that they find these things amusing. But it would be no more... they're referred to in terms of like LARPers, live action role play people. But the idea of literally believing in the gods is ridiculous to them. And they would be affiliated with it in the same way that, say, you and I would be affiliated with Star Wars before it got melted in with Disney, right? So there are people who would definitely take it a long way, but it's no more than that, a hobby. There's other people who have had, and I say legitimate because it is deceptive, but people who've had spiritual experiences, usually under the influence of narcotics, and said, well, I encountered the goddess, Freya or Frigg, depending on which copy you're reading, and she revealed these things to me, or I've had encounters with the Norse pantheon, I've received visions, I was a Christian for such and such amount of time, and God never audibly spoke to me, but then I smoked a bunch of hash, and Odin appeared to me directly. I have more reason to believe from my own experience these deities than yours. And you may think, okay, you were high and you're using that as a metric for spiritual truth? Yes, a lot of people do that. And that's something you need to be able to take seriously, because they have invested a lot of emotional stock in those personal experiences, regardless of the side detail that it was because their brain was in a blender. The third kind is, again, going to be people who have a family history affiliated with Norse paganism. I had a debate with a Swedish gentleman who just came from that kind of culture, and because of his social desires to have someone to fit in with, because Muslims are taking over their nation and committing acts of violence, arson, and persecution of men, women, and children on a regular basis, they need some sense of security. So it's almost like gang affiliation, for lack of a better term. But within this pagan community, they just check a few boxes regarding their beliefs about metaphysics, and they're able to depend on that for protection. And again, you see this with Muslims. You see this even with some Christians. that the only way I feel safe or have my desire for community and communal protection, tribalistic mindsets, if you will, not from a political party but a religious party, Norse paganism can accommodate that. There are some interesting groups that have come out of this Asatru alliance that would be little more than biker gangs, but I digress. Some of the more well thought through views on Norse paganism, and these will require the most tact, are animists. Again, I spoke to some person who was just themselves avowed as an animist, and for those of you who don't know, animist or anima, like the spirit, it's the belief that nature and the divine are one and the same, and so whatever you would call them, be it Thor, Frigg, Freya, Odin, whatever, or Horus, Isis, Osiris, Set, whatever, they would just affiliate the aspects of nature with names. And even if they don't literally believe in the personalities behind them, they find them as appropriate representations of nature as something greater than themselves.
I found that most ancient cultures spring from or have roots in pantheistic or polytheistic faiths that are really expressed from their culture. So these religious expressions come out of their culture, but the beliefs are somewhat common throughout all these cultures. You know, worshiping the elements, worshiping the stars, the sun, the moon, life, nature, and associating that with the divine. And it popularized too. Did you know there was a show with Jeff Goldblum called Chaos on Netflix?
I don't browse Netflix too often.
Well, it's a what if. What if the West was not influenced by Christianity, but actually by Norse paganism? And so it's chaos with a K. And let's say we live today in modern days, and the gods were real. What would they be like? And actually,
if the gods are real, that's a big leap. But
if there was really this one in this show, it's probably the Greek pantheon, but Zeus and all his kids and all the stories, but in a modern telling of what if they really existed and they still exist to this very day? Can we create a drama? And they really do one thing they do well is depicting. I've only watched a couple episodes, but depicting on just how petty. I'm not recommending it, but just how petty and really human-like the quote-unquote gods are.
Because that's little more than what the Greeks were doing. They were just personifying aspects of nature or human impulse, I should say. But that's the point being made. In my experience, though, the first thing that I did was read. I didn't go out on a crusade and tried to put myself in situations where I would own those pagans with my solid list of facts. No, I wanted to know where they're coming from. And that's the first thing that we all need to take away from any experience, be that with a Zoroastrian, a Muslim, Hindu, or a Norse pagan. Someone who holds those views can, at face value, be held to a set of beliefs. Otherwise, they'd call themselves a part of a different community. And this is the first and most important thing to do, is that when someone makes a claim for themselves, they have to live with that claim. Don't let them get away with redefining their religion in their own image. People who say would become Muslims, for example, don't say Islam is peaceful because I'm not violent. You don't determine what Islam is. You are calling yourself affiliated with a core set of claims and beliefs. Now, with Islam, it's easy to call them out on that because you can go to their actual sources. When they try and hide behind the Arabic, you can show them the Arabic. They won't speak it. They'll go to their imam. The imam will either have to admit it or lie to them. You can show them this kind of train of thought. It's very simple. Norse pagans, I'd say, are the third easiest to deal with in terms of religious worldviews that are gaining traction on the internet because, along with the classic commonplace names like Thor's hammer and so forth, they actually have a set of written beliefs about what their gods are and aren't. Now, what they don't know about those set core of beliefs is that the writings weren't actually compiled by Norse pagans themselves. And this was part of the research that I did. When I looked at the Bible, for instance, and I said, okay, these are obviously my core sets of beliefs, and if I want to learn something about God, then I want to start with the Bible. Well, that a standard that can apply both ways. Would the Bible survive the same standards as Norse paganism, and would vice versa, this Norse pagan sources survive the same standards as the Bible? The reason why and this is the first thing to note when establishing common ground with somebody, is when you're researching, have a goal in mind. I'm talking to someone who considers their poems, their resources, the revelation and wisdom of Odin preserved through our culture as the reason why they believe in these things. Okay, well, let's read that then. What is that compared to the Bible? And if you obviously start on common ground, that's going to make a lot more progress. But if someone's going to make the comparison, again, realize the Bible has a lot more going for it than you would give it credit for. The thing is, the Bible, like the Eddas, this is the term for the sacred text of Odinism, but there would be other books like the sagas of the Danes and so forth, ancient stories that would be affiliated with these things. In Greek paganism, it would be the Theogony. That's speaking of a lot of text. In the same way, the Bible isn't a book. It's a collection of 66 books, 39 in the Old, 27 in the New, 40 different authors, 1,500 years of history. Now, the Eddas is also a collection of books, mostly from oral tradition, some gathered from manuscripts, but it's all hearsay because, like the Bible was, again, addressing a lot of different issues in 3 different genres, the majority of the Eddas, it starts with wisdom literature. There is some prophetic aspects to it, but the majority of it is just history, just talking about the exploits of such and such an individual that went and slayed a dragon, ate his heart, learned how to speak to it, the accounts of the Valkyries and their interactions with mankind, usually in one way, but the ideas are just that. And when you go through these sources, they make reflections on the nature of the gods that people then have to take seriously and go, okay, so that's what it means then. That's what inspired, say, for example, the Viking Age. When I read in Gylfaginning that the sons of Odin's adoptions are those who die in bloody battle, that's the mindset that Vikings were going on expeditions for. By the way, Viking, it's not a noun, it's a verb. To go on a Viking is to go on an expedition. You're seeking out a glorious death. And if you die in a bloody battle, then Odin would consider you worthy of his well, we'll get more into that later, but the idea is that there is consequences to these beliefs, and you can hold them to that and say, is this something you're willing to apply now, and if so, in what way? And you don't even have to necessarily call them wrong, just call them out on it. But not shying away from the challenge, what do the Eddas and the Bible have in common? As we said, they're both a collection of books. The Bible is an Anglican term that literally means that, the books, and it's organized in those genres. The Eddas, however, it's a genitive form of the name Odi, which is Icelandic, and this is where the writing came from, in an oral compilation of poetry in, this is the layout of it, 14 lays of the gods and 7 lays of the heroes. Lays or stories, poems, if you will. So the majority of it is referring to the gods and their shenanigans, but there's also a good third of it dealing with the heroes of legend as well, those who most embodied the ideal Norse men, the Norse culture. The second thing the Bible and the Eddas have in common with is that they were both compiled by Christians. I'll let that sit out there for another second. The Bible, again, was compiled during the councils of Laodicea, Hippo, and Carthage, and as Christians were finally able to legally meet in public without fear of imprisonment, torture, and death at the hands of the Romans, written records of people who predated these by centuries, Clement, Ignatius, Polycarp, Hippolytus, they were all examined as well as the books themselves and recognized, okay, the New Testament, the Old Testament, these covenants were tested according to the standard of a true prophet in Judaism. Were they accountable and perform public miracles? Were they consistent in their doctrine, and did they get their facts straight? And so when they tested these books, the authors, of course, also being accountable, they weren't lying about their identity, they were able to figure out, okay, the Christians themselves recognize this as the canon or the measurement, measuring stick, what measures up to the standard. The Eddas was also compiled by a Christian by the name of Snorri Sturluson, and this was in the 13th century A.D. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the Viking Age, you know that that was a long time after the last Viking had died out. And interestingly enough as well, Snorri Sturluson's compilation of these writings wasn't discovered in his lifetime. We don't have his copy. We have a version of it 300 years after that, in the 1600s, 1643 specifically, by a Christian bishop of Skalholt named Brynjolfur Svensson. Lots of Norse tongues here today. Now, again, since the Eddas itself wasn't written until 50 to 60 years after Snorri's death in 1241, it's all open to question, but it's generally accepted based on the standards that were employed by this bishop, and what the standards were, we aren't told. But because of the historical standards and preservation efforts of a single Christian bishop, Odinists know what their gods are like. Now you might say, but what about the Druids? What about all the traditions that were handed down in that culture? Once again, by the time we have the Eddas, the sources in writing, every single Druid had been exterminated, not by Christians, but by other pagans. If you're familiar with Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, he wiped out completely the Druish class, the Druid, there is a term for Jewish ethnically, but the Druids themselves were exterminated when Julius Caesar moved into what we would know as modern-day England and France, the Gaelic regions. Now, what's important to note about this as well is that with the elimination of their priest, the preservation of their culture was kaput. Their language, though ultimately becoming sophisticated, the runes were a little more than just acknowledgement of directions, maybe geography support, and maybe a dock here and there. But they will, of course, try to overstate these things and say, oh, they were superior in their language to that of the barbaric and ham-fisted together, what language we know today as English. No, go off of what we actually know. The reason why we don't have any collective writings is because they were entirely dependent on oral culture or oral tradition. These things being passed from word of mouth, unlike the Bible, wasn't an attempted effort until the Christians did that for them, after their culture had basically given up on it and had either converted to Christianity or Arianism. So with this in mind, the Eddas and the Bible itself, both being the work of Christians, is something that pagans are frankly embarrassed about. And being able to point this out to them is ultimately something that will make them ask questions, because if you trust the resources given to them about Norse mythology, everything that we know about them legitimately, not just hearsay, speculation, or what Stan Lee could make up in his basement compared to what we are, of course, studying about it today, the original, ancient, earliest to the actual sources we have, the best. And the earliest that we have comes from when the culture had already died. And that, of course, is going to sound fishy to everyone, and it should. But then you say, well, isn't the same true of the Bible? The answer is no. Because the third thing the Bible and the Eddas have is that they were tested based on the cultures they were centered around. The Bible's standard was not based on oral tradition. The Bible's standard wasn't based on what felt right. It was speaking to a Jewish culture, an Israeli mindset, and with the Hebrew standards for what qualified, and I mentioned this earlier, but I'll repeat it, for legitimate revelations from God. The standard of a prophet in Jewish cultures was determined whether their books in the Old or New Testament were sacred as opposed to historical. And we could note other examples of historical books. The books of Jasher, the Wars of the Kings, and others are mentioned in the Old Testament, weren't included in the Bible. So we see that Hebrew culture was very literate, and that is, of course, as the Chinese proverb says, the ink outlasts the longest memory. Writing things down is better than just trying to pass it on through word of mouth. We see other examples like Greek philosophers being quoted in the book of Acts, Epimenides' poems to Zeus, for instance. We see that in Deuteronomy 18 through 22, that compared to Moses, accuracy historically, consistency doctrinally, miraculous authentication, these were all very important when it came to the cultures they were speaking to and why they could be trusted. So it wasn't just, oh, we have some writing, so this is what we're going to work with. It's what reason do we have to trust this writing as one kind as opposed to another. Now, the culture of the Eddas was, again, different because, as I mentioned, Bishop Brynjolfur Svensson discovered a copy of the writings of Snorri Sturluson, as well as some of the writings of Saemund the Wise that would go back 100 more years, but the standards of his examination are not known. We don't have any written standards to examine before the time of this bishop, and modern scholars examine the linguistic style of the ancient Norse tongue and setting to determine when the Edis was dated, and on that basis, we mainly conclude that they were Icelandic, not Germanic in their origin. So with our earliest understanding of who Thor is, for example, that comes from the Germanic regions and the Aryan missionaries that engaged with them. That doesn't compare to the Icelandic information that we have, because all of the information in writing we have about Norse paganism that we depend on today comes from people who A, didn't believe it, and B, were removed from the culture being used to examine its authenticity. So if we were to say the Bible was in the same position as the Edis, it would all not have to depend on the majority of the authors of the Old Testament or these church councils. It would all have to be one person who claimed to be not even a Christian, a Roman pagan, for example. And that Roman pagan determined by Roman standards what Christianity seemed to be like to him from his specific culture and background, and out of respect for the now dead Christian movement, was willing to regard their memory out of respect, as well as his own family heritage. Maybe he had Christian great-great-grandparents, and said, I'm going to just get all that I can, and say, because of this background lining up with what I think Hebrew culture was like, we don't know, that would be the condition of the Bible compared to the Edis. But noting again that that's the best we have, that's all they have. And that's something that needs to be regarded. The fourth thing they have in common is that the Bible and the Edis do tell us about the nature of God. The book of Hebrews, verses 1 through 4 says, God, who in various times and in various ways spoke in times past to the fathers by the prophets, in these last days has spoken to us by his Son, whom he has appointed heir of all things, through whom he also made the worlds, who is the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, and upholding all things by the word of his power, when he had himself purged our sins, sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become so much better than the angels, as he has by inheritance obtained a more excellent name than they. Now, compared to the followers of Asatru, they wouldn't look at these texts that would reveal that God has a son who shares his nature, who is superior to other creatures that are even above us, like the angels. Noted that God has spoken in history, cite the prophets. The Old Testament is noting that, uses the word and influence of his son, Jesus, through, of course, his revelation of who he is as God, is now with God and is going to return, as we can note in other texts. What would that be compared to those who would come out of Iceland? Because that's where all of our understanding of ancient Norse culture comes from. They would, as the point we made earlier about animism would be concerned, consider nature and their own intuition, how the gods commune with and reveal themselves to their followers. God doesn't speak. You have experiences and you have to interpret them. This ceremony is not one I'll say on air, but it's little more than what pagans were doing all the time in order to get themselves into frenzies, and it wasn't just drugs. The names, the characteristics, and of course the Odinist's ability to distinguish one of the Azir from another is impossible without any written history regarding their religion, which is what it's all based on. And therefore, in spite of the insights of people like Stephen McNellan, the Asatru Alliance, who, by the way, has been outed from the Asatru community on 2 separate occasions because of his affiliation with white supremacy, the Edis is a necessary component for their religion in understanding the difference between the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and the gods of their Norse ancestors. We can both note that they make historical claims, but being willing to say that, of course, God created the heavens and the earth, for example, the universe came into existence at one point and had a designer. Jesus in Matthew 24, 1 through 2 notes 5 days before his execution, known as Palm Sunday, that massive stones that made up the Jewish temple would be thrown down and not left one over another. But the most important historical claim that all evangelism needs to be based on, if the conversation matters in terms of history, is going to be what was an ancient creed. These were short summary statements or poems that would be memorized by early believers who may not have been literate, but would still be able to access information the same way you and I can recall the commercial jingle, for example. Now, 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7 gives us a summary of not only early Christian belief regarding Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, but also his deity, and as it was verified by the eyewitnesses, of which they name 5 by name, but document over 500 witnesses at one time. And atheist scholars, John Dominic Crossan, James D.Z. Dunn, Gerhard Luderman, Bart Ehrman, others, would date this creed within months, no more than 2 years by the most skeptical of them, of the events they were actually reporting, compared to the Eddas, which of course is reporting events that go millennia by some arguments after they had actually taken place. Now, for example, Voluspo 3 through 4, this is one of the books, the verses within them, they credit creation. Genesis 1, their version is Voluspo 3 through 4. Ymir, the first frost giant, is created from the meeting of the cold and hot realms that apparently existed before the universe, and upon further details given in Vathruthnismol and Gylfaginning, it was from his corpse that the world we know was actually created when Odin killed his own grandpa, and his brothers did as well. He said that his brains are the clouds and his bones are the mountains and all that other stuff. We note in Baldur's Drummer that Odin travels to Hell, not double H Hell, by the way, just the underworld, to interrogate a wise woman against her will to tell him the reasons for his son Baldur's bad dreams. His death follows as a literal event, according to Gylfaginning and Lokasenna. Lokasenna, by the way, is a series of mockery jests between Loki and the other members of Odin's Hall. It's actually pretty amusing if you want to read it, but don't have kids in the room. The material they discuss is pretty graphic. Voluspo, verses 51 through 58, notes that Ragnarok will be an event in the future where all the Aesir will die in battle. But I digress. All of these claims are, in fact, claims about history, the present relevance, and, of course, the future.
What's Ragnarok?
Literally means the fate of the gods. But these
and I was doing it in my best Hulk voice.
Yes. These claims are either true or they aren't. And while the majority of the events of the Eddas only take place in the realms beyond our own, and the historical figures they mention in our world can't be verified apart from the Eddas itself, this would force most Odinists to dismiss their own scripture as history and just claim that it's symbolic. You see Christians attempt to do this too when they don't want to do their homework, but I digress. Whether this is to avoid embarrassment or accountability, that's on them. You can be the judge individually. But on the other hand, when we stand on the Bible, it's formatted, treated, and tested the same way that the Eddas is. The only difference between the two is simply this: the Bible passed those tests. All that Odinists can do is redefine the purposes of their scripture so they can't be. And that's the point. So when we're talking to someone on terms of history, we can stand in confidence and say, these are the things I have going for it. I can't answer every question. Maybe I need to go back and re-listen to this or ask questions on A Reason for Hope. We'll be happy to give you more information as is necessary, or even send your Norse pagan friends here. But when we are dealing with these topics, it ultimately stands or falls on, am I consistent? This is my reason for believing Christianity. Well, if my reason is bad, like I had an experience with Jesus, the drug-induced Norse pagan can say I had an experience with Freya. The Christian who says, well, I feel like this is true and I get my sense of community from the church, they can say, well, I feel that Asatru is true and I get my sense of community from Norse paganism. Either are passing these standards. This is the opportunity the internet gives us, because given these accesses to ideas that, unless you lived in Sweden or Germany, you would have no idea would even exist unless you had, just that guy in town sharing it with everyone and everybody, they would give us the opportunity to say, I need better reasons for the reason for the hope that is within me. I need to think through and make my own these beliefs, lest I end up in the same position that a Norse pagan is, who, apart from formatting, is in the same place before God as I am. I don't want to be in affiliation with God by accident, because I approach my beliefs about God and my relationship with Him the same way that someone who doesn't know him would and came to an opposite conclusion. I want to be able to say, these are the reasons I have to believe what I believe. These are the reasons I am convinced that this is true. When you first come to a relationship with Jesus, you don't need to know how to spell infralapsarianism. But when someone makes their faith their own, they need to be able to stand in confidence on these things and care enough about them to say, here are some reasons why I should believe this, and you should too. We're all called to do the work of evangelists. So when we're talking about these things, knowing the historical origins of your own beliefs helps. Knowing the historical strengths of your beliefs is going to help. But if you're called to a specific ministry, and note, calling can include a moment's opportunity. They want to have a follow-up conversation with you. Can I look that up and get back to you? It really, really gets sad. Because with the refounding of Asatru on May 16th, 1973, when England, Iceland, Germany, and North America recognized it legally as a religion, their ceremonies, the first blot ceremony, which was this basically offering of blood and a ritualistic sacrifice of an animal, these offerings in alignment with the solstice of the seasons are entirely speculative. If the Norse gods are real, their attempts to commune with them are entirely based on, I hope I'm right. Because we have no writing that would actually come from people who interacted with the gods, as the Edis, of course, reports, or the people who were models of them, like the Edis talks about in the Lays of Heroes. This is what we need to be able to say, is that I've taken the time to read these, even operas, where, like, Viking helmets were introduced with the horns and stuff, when the reality was that wasn't the case. When we're talking about, they were just a bunch of heathens that were raping, pillaging, and torturing, being able to say, well, here are the actual historical records for that and why it was so brutal and barbaric. Being able to say, yeah, I don't think there's a lot of evidence for the blood raven torture methods, but you do realize everyone was doing brutal things back then. We have Viking mercenaries boasting about their records of hanging body parts off their armor in order to intimidate people, because the Catholic Church's armed escort of the pilgrims to repair the Church of the Holy Sepulchre needed manpower, and the Vikings are more than willing to seek out violent deaths in foreign lands. Why? From what we know about their traditions. But this is the whole point. When we are talking to people, we are talking to people just like us, just as much worthy of dignity and respect as we are and ought to be treated. And if we can quote to them chapter and verse their own records, that's going to go a lot farther than someone who's just going to say, my dad's tough. No, my dad's tough. No, my God's tough. No, your God is weak. And just going into these terms. But if you run into that kind of person, and again, we can go into the evidence. You can listen to our Apologetics Monday on Wicca, where we went through the evidence for the resurrection, if you're encountering someone who's more on the animistic side of things. But say, for example, you run into someone who's saying, no, just doctrinally, these are my claims about the Norse gods, and I think that my God's superior to yours. Well, let's finish up the broadcast with just a note of comparison. And if you want to see this in more detail, I have a video on it noting, again, the Edis versus Christianity. And you can feel free to ask for its link in the comment section. But if I would take their text as seriously as I do my own, what are the differences? Well, is your God eternal? Mine is. In Psalm 90, verse 1 through 2, we read, Lord, you have been our dwelling place for all generations, before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God. And you can use this in their terms and say, hey, you note that Odin was around after. His father came from the sweat of Ymir, right? Well, God is saying he was around before even the realms of cold and heat. Before this world as we know it was formed, God existed. Can you say the same for your God? Odin's date, of course, remains written by the Norns. This is referring to their fate, and Norse paganism at its core is a very nihilistic predestination worldview. Your fate was decided before you're born, and Odin is kind of playing that role as well through the Valkyries. But we're told in the Prose Edis of Gylfaginning, section 6, that Odin is going to die at the hands of Fenrir, the son of Loki, the giant wolf that he apparently keeps feeding in his basement rather unwisely, setting up his own fate. Note the theme there. But also noting as well, began to exist when his father Bor sired him from the giantess Bisla, along with his brothers Vili and Vi. So if that's in fact the case, your greatest god, Odin, has a beginning and will have an end. Our God does not. And that's something that needs to be taken into consideration. When we say, for example, well, my God's a warrior. So is ours. In the book of Exodus, chapter 15, verses 1 through 7, this is the song of Moses. I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has cast into the sea. His chosen captains are drowned in the Red Sea. The depths have covered them. They sank to the bottom like a stone. Your right hand, O Lord, has become glorious in power. Your right hand, O Lord, has dashed the enemy in pieces. In the greatness of your excellence, you have overthrown those who rose against you. You sent forth your wrath. It consumed them like stubble. We see in the New Testament as well that Jesus in Revelation 19 will appear on a white horse, and he was called faithful and true, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. He's described as having eyes like a flame of fire, on his head having many crowns, a name written which no one knew him except himself. His clothes were a robe dipped in blood, and his name is the Word of God. Now, you make a comparison to the Norse pagans. Odin, Tyr, Thor, many others have claimed to have bested a lot of giants, dwarves, elves, and men, and even other equivalents to gods, but they all pale in comparison to my God's prowess in battle. He wins victories with a breath. He annihilates armies just by showing up, as we read in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 8. You can claim that your God is a king, but so is mine. Read Jeremiah chapter 10 and verse 10, or 1 Timothy 1 and verse 17, where he's called not only king, but king eternal, immortal, invisible, to God who alone is wise. These are things that you would claim about Odin, but even if we're just referring to territories, Odin's domain may be vast compared to all the other realms, but my God owns every realm, Yggdrasil and beyond. These are terms that would be helpful to be familiar with. Is your God a giver of life? Mine is. In Job 33 and verse 4, we're told, the Spirit of God made me, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life. Colossians 1:15 through 17 makes the same principle. But according to the Prose Edis, Gylfaginning section 5, life was produced not from Odin or any of the Aesir, but from sweat that came from the first frost giant. And also notice as well, there's no conscious will involved in that process. Ymir just showed up one day and the giant soon afterwards. Bor, Odin's father, is credited for crafting Axir and Embla out of wood in section 9 of Gylfaginning, but he isn't your God. Nor is he the source of life for Buri, or Ymir, his father. So if my God's the source of all life, we would note this as well, not just the origin, but the maintainer of it, as we read in Revelation chapter 4 and verse 11. My God will win the final battle, as we read in Revelation 19, verses 19 through 21. Ragnarok, the fate of the gods, no matter what is done to prepare, is prophesied to be a loss. He's going to die and stay dead at the hands of Fenrir. And the last time I checked in terms of betting on positive things, betting on a loser doesn't seem like a good decision as far as your ultimate destiny is concerned. Can your God become a man? Mine did. In Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 14, therefore the Lord will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel, which is translated God with us. This was literally described as fulfilled in Philippians 2, 5 through 11. Read it as the Carmen Christi on your own time. Now, there's many stories of Odin wandering around the world in the form of a man, but has he committed himself to mankind in the same way that, say, for example, Odin committed himself to his wives? If you read the stories, you'd know that they're constantly weeping and they make jewelry out of the tears. And this is the point. My God entered humanity to establish a relationship with us, not momentarily to entertain himself. I don't care what Matt Dillahunty says. Does your God tell the truth? Mine does. In Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 17, God said, thus determining to show more abundantly the heirs of the promise, the immutability of his counsel, confirmed it by an oath, by which two immutable things, which is impossible for gods to lie, Numbers 23:19, but that we might have a strong consolation who have fled for refuge to lay hope or hold of the hope set before us. So he's not only trustworthy, but by nature he can't lie. Can the same be said of your God? Odin is prone to deception and manipulation as any other Azir, or man for that matter. In the Poetic Eddas, the second lay of Helgi, Sigrun, one of the Valkyries, records her cursing her brother Dag for yet another one of her husbands being murdered, to which verse 33 rightly attributes Odin responsible for everything wrong in this world, and I quote, "sundering kin with runes of spite. My God restores relationships. We're the ones that sever them." And this is the whole point. We can talk about how big God's house is, how wealthy God is, how majestic he is. We can talk about God's spear being better than Odin's. We can talk about anything, but this is where it ultimately matters. Does your God defeat death? Mine did. In 1 Corinthians 15:25 through 26, we read, "For he must reign till he has put all enemies under his feet. The last enemy that will be destroyed is death." And we're told when that will happen in Revelation 20:14. "All the gods of the Norse will meet their fate as determined for all of them. My God conquered what your gods are enslaved to." And this is what ultimately needs to be held. If you can quote their chapters and verses, the common ground can be established on exactly that. But if they have no respect for their own scriptures, you need to be able to call them out on the carpet and say, why do you believe it? Here are my reasons for believing these things. I hope that you have more reasons than this, than a hobby for the agnostic, for a community like the social Azir. But even more importantly, when it comes to the things that they would look for as marks or signs of divinity, all you have to do is look these things up. They're free and accessible online. And while they can make a lot of claims and saying, oh, Baldur was a copy of Jesus, dates don't check out. We didn't know about Baldur till the 1600s. We knew about Jesus 1,300 years before that. It's a complete copy, not our earliest. And I could go on and on. But the point being made is this. Note my methodology. Read first. Respect someone enough to be able to meet them on their terms and use their language. Have enough confidence in Christianity to know it can stand by its own strengths. Take a historical method, a doctrinal method, or a personal one, but note that who you're talking to is someone Jesus also died for, and they need the same kind of grace and respect that you have been shown as God did a work in your life as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Sean. What do you think is growing the popularity of this movement?
Pretty much anti-Semitism.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, and I know that you can check out some of the debates on his YouTube channel. I'd encourage you to check it out. We'll be back tomorrow, and don't forget, David Guzik is speaking at our church Wednesday night. We'll see you then. God bless you.
You've been listening to A Reason for Hope. Thank you again for joining us as we continue our journey through God's Word, one question of the heart at a time. Until we meet again, we would love to connect with you. You can text or email your questions to questionsforhope@gmail.com. You can also find out more about our ministry at calvarychristianfellowship.com. And be sure to join us next time on A Reason for Hope. A Reason for Hope is an outreach ministry of Calvary Christian Fellowship in Tucson, Arizona.